attention. So I want to achieve two things tonight, if I may. The first is to describe the terms of a new debate emerging globally around the future of rail supply. And secondly, to leave you with some food for thought and some questions perhaps about how that debate will evolve and what impacts we may see. So, structure, engineers. The lecture has 4 parts. My colleagues have produced in the presentation little spot dots at the bottom of the page so you'll know exactly where you are through the piece. If I'm running out of time, Craig here will start to flag. So the 4 parts are these. First, there's global mega trends. These are fueling the demand for rail and rail transport. Secondly are the implications of the trends for the rail sector. Third, what that means for us here in the UK. And fourth, and of course finally, how the UK rail supply industry is already responding to a number of those challenges. So what do I mean tonight for the rail supply industry? And we all have different views about what this is. I can't make any apologies for this. The industry, as far as I'm concerned, for tonight's lecture is all kinds of rail travel, of course, high-speed, regional, urban, and so on, and all types of products connected to that, or systems or services. And I think it's helpful to divide it into the sections shown on this slide. First, the manufacturers, be that infrastructure, rolling stock, signalling, and indeed services. We have system integrators who take all of those products and subsystems and turn them into a finalised railway. And some may argue that that definition simply isn't good enough and there's more to it than that. And I would say for tonight that's quite fair, but I'm focusing on that. Now, let's just pause a moment because I think this is probably the most important starting point of all. It's the global market, and before we talk about the global market, stepping back to look at this big picture, I want to reflect on the megatrends, and one of the megatrends, and it affects us historically, it affects society as a whole, not just rail, and it's the question of the environment. And I think this is what presents us with the most exciting challenges of all in railway. So we all know the story. Global emissions, they have to be reduced. And in December 2005, December this year, the United Nations Climate Change Summit have their event in Paris. And if an agreement's reached, and we hope it will be reached, it'll be the first time in history that all countries will have agreed to act. So it's a massive prize. The EU's proposition is to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030. The China and the US have already made significant offers along those lines, and India has made ambitious commitments on renewable energy. What you might not know is that the rail industry has made its own pledge. I don't know whether you know that or not. I don't know whether it's represented publicly or expressed in any particular documents I've seen, but it is so. The UIC, the International Union of Railways, has committed to global emission reductions of 50% by 2030 and a huge 75% by 2050. So it sits there right behind everything else I'm going to present tonight. So we can be sure of two things as the environmental debate evolves. The first one is rail, as one of the lowest emitters in the transport sector, will continue to be prioritised by governments all over the world, and indeed in Europe, of course. Secondly, there will be an even greater pressure to increase the energy efficiency of rail transport. So a great example and a shameless plug, and I could use another one about a train that was tested today somewhere in Britain, and congratulations to that company because it's an important moment, is Alstom's energy recovery braking system, which will take 15% at least of the energy generated by during braking and transmit it and recover it and put it back into the public grid quite locally and be used as energy to drive the train following. It's already used in Paris, not very well, not on a very large scale. We've piloted it here in the UK with London Underground, and that pilot has just finished, so we're moving on. It's one of dozens of examples I could have referenced tonight. The second megatrend I wanted to talk about is urbanisation. Urbanisation. The world's urban population has grown rapidly from a paltry 746 million in 1950 to 3.9 billion today. By 2045, that figure will be a staggering 6 billion. By 2050, 66% of the world's population will be living in cities. There are 28 cities worldwide with at least 10 million people inhabiting them. By 2030, 12 more will have entered the ranks of mega cities. Sorry, before I go on to that, I want to say a bit more about urbanisation. In fact, in infrastructure investment terms, that's only 15 years away. 15 years, 20 years away. It's a really short time for infrastructure. Now, I reckon new alliances will be formed around those mega movements and this dramatic transformation, so it's a fascinating time. I wanted to make reference to the Japanese at this point because of one single proposed development based around a megacity view. It's how they're helping India, the Japanese are helping India to develop 100 smart cities. So the two countries have already agreed to develop the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. That's 1,500 kilometres dedicated to freight transport as a single project. So these are projects of the future. They're massive and they're a different scale to anything we've seen in our careers in our past. The role of the government, though, does play a completely new role in these mega projects. The third mega trend is population. So population growth, as I've shown on this chart, but otherwise, and the greater economic development means more mobility, which means more transport. And if the world population is going to exceed 9 billion by 2050, what does it mean in Britain? The statistics for London are shocking. And I know that the debate here is about the powerhouse of the north and London getting too much investment. But here in London, the population is expected to reach 11.3 million by 2050. That's 37% increase. And that's a city the size of Birmingham extra. It'll put enormous strain on the capital, and we already have a backlog of investment here. Whatever we think about how much investment there is, or has been, there's still a backlog. There are massively rising expectations from inhabitants of London, and we have historically low levels of capital investment compared to international standards, and I can speak more about that. So the city mayor has started to address that through the London Infrastructure Plan. And just like the National Infrastructure Plan, there is clearly a huge mountain to climb. Now the fourth point, global growth. Global growth. The fourth megatrend. So the chart shows three things, but the most important, I suppose, is the growth of the developing countries. Growth is accelerating all over the world, but there are two speeds to that growth. There's a developed market growth and there is a developing world growth. And what we find is that there's an absolute correlation between GDP development and transport investment and transport development. Clearly, what's going to happen in the next 10 years is that the development outside Europe is going to be far faster and far greater than the development inside Europe. So, of course, that has massive implications for the UK and EU exports, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. So when I started in industry, which frankly was quite a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago compared to, you know, the experiences perhaps you've had and the knowledge about the industry, it's a short time. And in that short time, I can tell you something. If anybody, when I started in the railway, had mentioned a project in Doha or in Delhi, nobody would have believed you. There were so few that were believable and deliverable. They were mythical projects, and there were mythical projects all over the world. And they never left the drawing board, and that has completely changed. And the fifth is technology. So, technology, right. This is the world before marketing and commodities. The history of technological progress provides powerful evidence that change is not linear but exponential. Cycles of innovation and technology improvements are very likely to accelerate even further. I know these are often driven by big events like wars, and they leap in clusters. And we do have now the experience of sort of a viral adoption of technologies. But change is also occurring in the primary side of things. Nanotechnologies, biotech, and information technology, to name a few. Materials like graphene, composites, carbon fibre and so on will have revolutionary opportunities in the railway, but rarely or barely any of these have been adopted in the railway we know today. Developments in material science and also dramatically improving the performance of batteries, changing the potential of electrical storage and so on. 3D printing, which I don't know if anybody's actually witnessed 3D printing, but I've been absolutely staggered in the presentations I've seen on it. Real products coming out of a printer and being able to be developed in one country by design and produced and delivered in a second country without any industrial facility at all. It's absolutely staggering. And intelligent robots, of course, which I can go on about. So in short, I believe we're seeing a kind of a new explosion in technology. Now, I believe also something else. They're being adopted overseas at a faster rate than the UK market in general. The speed of adoption in new technologies and new solutions wins wars, yes. It's no different in the economic battle between companies and economies. And it was Darwin who said that it's not the strongest who will succeed, but those who can change the quickest. Now, for the railway, if I'm honest, I would say that rail doesn't really currently change or adapt as quickly as it could. So it's a challenge. Okay. And finally, ageing. I don't know why this has been put here. It's an outrageous, naughty reflection on age. But it does make me look slender. But seriously, this is a big trend, and particularly in Europe, where both the median age and the share of people aged 65 or older is expected to grow. Obviously, that places challenges upon us, but there's bound to be more emphasis on transport and, indeed, mobility. So, all that was to make the point, I suppose, and the point being to remind ourselves that we're in a totally different world today, more exciting and more unpredictable. So what are the implications for the supply chain? So, onto some steady facts and some statistics. If those were the global trends, what about the rail supply market itself? So the global market grew by 14 billion between 2009 and 2013, despite one of the worst recessions the world has ever seen. Looking forward, it's expected to grow by a further 26 billion, and that's by 2019. So well within our horizons. The difference is it's driven mainly by the Americas and by Asia. The pattern that emerges is consistent with what I said earlier about two speeds. Western Europe, and I'll show this on this slide, I think. Yes, Western Europe remains the largest market. The growth rates in Latin America, Asia and CIS, however, are much higher. So, driven by high demand for rail freight transport in China and in India and Asia's rapidly growing urban population. And I have to say, a new emerging protectionism, which I believe is on the rise. And in China's case, with big state enterprises in the rail supply sector, backed today by government pockets. So just as the European supply chain is readying itself for a new wave of opportunities in the world market, will Asia close the door? It's a very important point to us. And indeed, are markets fair? And of course, are they hell? So will the European Commission and the EU government continue to take a softly approach to that and those contexts? Probably yes. So there clearly is a jeopardy for us. So let's be clear. The European market is largely a replacement market today. It's not enough on its own to sustain a vibrant EU supply industry. The UK, however, is a significant bright spot. It's bucking the general trend, and I'll talk about that later, but it's more worthy of investment than any of the European countries I can see. So, I want to talk about the EU now. It's a reflection perhaps on a slide you may not have seen before. What's the baseline? This is the European baseline. So where do we start from? Well, Europe today is in rude health. The European rail industry employs something like 400,000 people, and in terms of production value, locomotive and rolling stock Those markets are the most important. They're almost equal by the market segment for rail infrastructure. Signalling and electrification follow, but at some distance. Now, this market has traditionally been dominated by three major players, being Alstom, Bombardier, and Siemens. But times are really changing. There's a massive fragmentation right now going on right under our noses as the appetite for risk is shrinking. And indeed, the focus, and therefore the dissipated attention, the focus on new markets dilutes the domestic attention. Smaller players are re-entering the market, and at the same time, every country wants a national champion, whether it's Spain with CAF or Poland with PESA, doesn't matter. But it's wrong to imagine that the European companies are not conscious of ceding this ground. The question is, will they allow it to continue? And what will be their response? And of course, markets abhor a vacuum, as we know. In terms of exports, though, the EU does continue to lead, with 21% of worldwide trade. The EU also currently has a very low import ratio. With the exception of Japan, the EU commands rail's trade surpluses with all competing economies. So there is a European success story which we are a part of. And what about R&D? So, research and development, close to our hearts. We, as a rail industry, spend significant amounts on R&D. It's about 2.7% of our total turnover. But we still lag behind other sectors such as aerospace, as you can see from the slide, and defence. The prospects of a purely technological advance vary substantially depending on the type of technology. Vehicle design improvements are expected to reduce weight, rolling resistance, drag coefficient, and so on. In engine designs, we'll have more efficient and less polluting engines. Permanent magnet motors are a good example of the developments in motor technology. Composites, silicon carbides in traction drives, and of course you all know about the massive development in onboard communications. There's also a whole raft of innovations coming around on ERTMS and indeed the digital railway, as it's been coined. So all of this is exciting and challenging, but the EU industry is facing massive challenges to stay ahead on leading edge technology. And while we debate those challenges or problems, others are moving forward rapidly. And this brings me to this slide. And I hope this is helping. We're still on point one, by the way. I've got a long way to go yet. This is the world as a snapshot, and it is obviously represented by some flags. And it shows a bright, big, new red flag. And again, I'm not sure whether everybody in this room is aware of this, but two Chinese manufacturers have just recently merged and have become the world leading suppliers. They represent 24% of the supply to the railways worldwide, with a business base of around 40 billion, supported by their government entirely, of course. Now, do we care? And who's we? You know, most firms, Alstom as well, make their kit in low labour cost countries. It's all part of our international game. So why not just buy? Why not just buy all this technology and all this equipment? Is there indeed a justification for making it? And what's the argument for make versus buy? And indeed, what evidence is there? So that's the trends and the markets, and we've seen three pretty big themes. I hope I've shown them to you. The first is growth. It's unparalleled and it's worldwide. The second is that old models are changing or are already dead, and we just don't know it. And the third is rail is strategic as seen by other governments. So other countries' governments see rail as strategic. So those are all contextual slides. The second part of my lecture tonight is about four themes. So these four themes, very quickly I want to mention them. First, we're already experiencing a major revolution. So that's old models partnerships and approaches on the markets are all breaking down. We might be smiling as manufacturers, but it's happening, and it's happening quietly, but it's happening. So that's where we are as manufacturers. Generally, we view that positively, not negatively, and it creates exciting growth opportunities ahead. But it's a different kind of growth. There are new markets in new regions, new ways of doing business, and we're not really ready for that in Europe. It's not a British point I'm making, it's a European point. The second is we're entering a decade of the technologist. I firmly believe this, and I'll stress this further and more strongly later on in the presentation, but I believe the dawn of the digital railway and the numerous technologies waiting and queuing at the door to be used is unique to this period and this generation. And indeed, I repeat again, do we make or do we buy? Do we make locally, or do we ship from mega plants somewhere in the world at low cost? The third point is market liberalisation. It's here to stay, but governments are not backing off and are interventionist. So it's an uneasy relationship. And it's case by case, and it's country by country, but it's part of the realpolitik of being an international company. The bottom line is that infrastructure investment, with the rail featuring prominently, is now a key part of most governments' economic strategies, whether that's a European country seeking to pep up a sluggish economy or a developing country driving for new growth. And fourth and finally, the supply industry is facing huge challenges on attracting the right people in terms of skills, and indeed attracting the right type of finance in an increasingly interconnected and competitive world. Some EU countries, and I would argue the UK is one of them, report chronic shortages now of railway engineers. And let's face it, the industry does have, I believe, still an industry image problem. Young people don't see the rail sector as dynamic with exciting career paths. I'm going to correct that. I think they're starting to. But it's a brand new change. I would say it's only happened in the last 2 to 3 years. And it will require a fundamental change in attitude. Tony Blair, once said that he could declare war unnoticed if the subject of his speech was how to bridge the skills gap. And sadly, I think that's right. Will we succeed? It's too early to say, in my opinion. But what is clear is that in the next decade, or the next decade will be crucial in determining the long-term success of the rail industry, and I think it's sink or swim. So, you're all glum now, aren't you? You're all glum. It sounded glum. It wasn't intended to be, but it's supposed to make the point that the world has shifted massively from anything we had expected 5 years ago. The third part of my lecture tonight, then, is about what this means for the UK. So what does it mean for the UK? Well, we already know that rail makes a massive contribution to the UK economy. It's a key industrial sector. And together, the supply industry and train operating companies collectively employ 212,000 people. That's around 70,000 more than the UK automotive industry, which has about 141,000. And we contribute collectively to around 4 billion a year to the exchequer. Bravo. And we shift 3 million people a day. That's absolutely key to the health of the economy. So the rail sector in this country is experiencing a renaissance. Now, I believe firmly the UK is in the most fascinating and the most studied rail market in the world. People look to the UK to see how to do it, or even what to do. Many other countries, I contest and argue, look on us enviously as to the reforms and the initiatives we're taking, from privatisation to innovative financing to alliancing and so on. They want to know how we're doing it, and they want to know why we're doing it, but they do want to learn from our experiences. So, freight. Let's look at freight. This is really often forgotten, and I'm an apologist for that as well. I think freight is often forgotten. It's vital to the competitiveness of the UK economy, and it's transformed itself since the mid-1990s. It's a really competitive industry today. Total volumes have increased by over 80% since 95. 1 in 4 containers entering the UK is now shifted by rail. Every year, the 5 major rail freight operators transport goods worth over 30 billion. Now, I think that's a major success story, but why don't we feel good, or even better? And let's not forget as well that freight reduces CO2 emissions by up to 76% compared to road transport. So, there we are. What does the future hold? I believe that there are big opportunities. Okay, what are they? 38 billion of projects in the National Infrastructure Plan. There's Crossrail 2. There's HS2 and HS3 indeed. There's a fascinating range of business opportunities based around the projects that we can see in the market and we can see now. We've also got London Underground's investment, which is phenomenal. And we've got electrification of the mainline railway at rates and scales that we've never seen before since the early 60s. And it's astonishing to think the railway is still only around 40% electrified. It's an astonishing fact. When it was one of the plans of a government in the 1970s, and I don't want to say who was the Prime Minister at the time because I've forgotten. But he made a pledge to fully electrify the railway, I think, by 1972. So that's how far we haven't come. I also want to comment on the number of rolling stock procurements that are going to need to occur by the mid-20s. We're talking about thousands of new trains are required. So it's a pipeline of projects well into the 2020s and a prospect that most industries would absolutely love to have. But I think we have a problem, and the problem is the supply industry. I don't think it's set up to maximise the returns for the UK today. The industry gets it, they do get it, but it's still in development mode and it needs help to progress. I would even argue it's locked into a kind of a syndrome of seeing projects, of only seeing technology as pulled by the market, and of only seeing franchises as the driver, and only seeing domestic demand, and to hell with the world markets. So we're still, I believe, and I argue tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in tactical mode, reactive mode, and project mode. And strategy eats tactics and projects for breakfast. So, it's time to see the rail industry as strategic as our world's competitors do. I've shown this slide for one reason only. It's to explain the concern, and it was an alarming concern that we've reacted to, so there's a smiley face at the end of all this. But here you see how the rail privatisation model actually operates, and you'll see that supply chain doesn't actually fit in it, it fits as a consequence to it. And that was the dilemma when we represented ourselves almost 2 years ago to the government and said we need to do something. This just isn't good enough. Now, railway operators and infrastructure managers are in a highly competitive market, and understandably, survival is their number one priority. Now, we know this model does not address the supply industry issues, but because of that, they have really relatively little interest or involvement in technological development purely and per se. And that's a real challenge compared to other industries' railway models. But the logic's there. R&D costs are high, immediate returns are uncertain, and without the volume benefit of an export market, which local operators don't strive for or need to get because it's not part of their business model, they can't afford the pressure of returns that would only be made by developing that technology for its export markets. Which is kind of obvious, really. It's taken us a bit of time to turn around and see that for what it is. So I believe the pressure in delivering short-term has obscured the need for investment in the long term. That market imperative was reinforced by privatisation. And why should, or even why would, a 5-year franchisee help to develop a technology that won't produce a return for 20 years? But how could a supplier invest in a 20-year technology without knowing that anybody at all would take it. But we know, and as engineers you know, that if we're to bring costs down, which is one of the challenges the railway is facing, and increase efficiency, we have to have the whole industry driving investment and innovation and technology. So it's a fundamental flaw, I believe, that the industry and the government has to solve. The supply chain can't do it on its own, but it has got itself around the question and is starting to do something about it. So, consequences. First to exports, and I apologise to the people in the room that have seen this in the RSG presentation before now. These are facts that might not be facts because everybody's arguing about them, which is great, because I'm not really talking about the detail, I'm talking about the scales. Two consequences of short-termism, ladies and gentlemen. The first is exports. UK companies obviously have world-class products. 66% of Railway Industry Association export, and a further 10% plan to do so. We've interviewed them and researched that statistic. But look at the size of the exports that we're achieving. Now, I have to say there's no comprehensive data sitting behind these figures, but they're shocking. 20% is an understatement for France, and I can attest to that personally, working for a French company and knowing more about the data. These are the numbers I could rely on. Germany's exporting close to 50% of its GDP in the railway. So I think this is unsustainable. I really do think this is unsustainable. We once had a really strong export record, and we've lost it, and we have to get it back. Exporting is a key route to commercial resilience, and I'll come on to that a little later. But if we're going to face fluctuations of demand because we're delivering on a project basis, and we're going to have down cycles just as sure as we currently have an up cycle, then the balance of orders between exporting and the domestic market is going to be the determinant as to whether these companies that we're developing to be world class will survive or not. Do you agree with that? It makes obvious sense. So, long-term economic success of companies will be driven by the export markets, not by the domestic markets. Other countries are increasingly shifting away from lowest first price procurement. That's very important for the UK because we never claim to be the cheapest when we're exporting a product. We don't need to be, because the world is starting to get it, that actually it's about the best value whole life cycle cost product. And we are educating the world's markets in that philosophy. And the world's markets that visits the UK to see how we're getting on doing things are taking account of that. And it's being written into far more procurement internationally. This doesn't look good either, which is why I'm putting it up, because I want to make my point in Terence Watson style, which is a bit brutal. But I will say, patents is the second point. The UK barely patents in its technology for the railway. It barely patents, and that's a consequence of not having a world market to patent, to sell to. For many years, our industry has delivered savings with existing technologies, and we know that. I've even heard somebody, can I say it? Can I say it? Yes, I can. I've heard somebody say in the last 20 months that the HS2 train they want has to be one that's currently available. Now, think about that. It'll be operating post-2025. If I was to project, and that individual and I had a conversation, but if I was to project that moment as being the 1962 moment, Mr. Roger Ford, he'd have been arguing for a steam train. He would have been arguing for a steam train. The first diesel train didn't come out until 1962, wasn't it? I couldn't imagine the conversation I had with this gentleman. Anyway, there we are. New technology is going to be driven through a patent system, and we are not up on patents at all. And I argue that's massive underinvestment. So the industry's at a real crossroads. We've got renewed focus. The latest plans will drive us towards cost reduction, and we get that. Improving the passenger experience, we get that. It's an essential part of my journey to work every day, yours. Lowering emissions, we get that. And the dawn of the digital railway. We've got to move from analogue and paper at some time. And the railway's got to do it. It's got to do it. So we can no longer survive on an iterative approach because existing technology is insufficient. We are, as I said earlier, moving towards a technology-led decade. It's a technology-led decade of change, and it's a technology-led decade of innovation. That means both faster implementation of existing technology used in other countries and a relentless drive to spur greater innovation in new technologies here. So, this is a bit of a cobble-up slide, and I apologise for that, but this slide shows that the UK is pretty good, indeed world-class, in several areas. And there are 8 areas where we have the potential to become world-class. And you could argue these. Everybody in the room could argue them and say that it's not really right, it's kind of wrong. But there's an even longer list in the other sectors where the UK is world-leading, and from which the rail industry could learn much. And for these sectors, rail offers another great source of growth. And I was talking to a gentleman just earlier at coffee who is looking at entering the rail sector as a supplier. That's exactly what we need. And it's a win-win, of course. So these lists kind of highlight another fundamental lesson. We need to focus on what we're good at. So, the UK has no turnkey domestic capability. In other words, we kind of know as we start out on this adventure that we are not good at everything. To deliver a major overseas project today, a real railway, a UK company has to join international consortia. And even after HS2, and by then I would wish that we would be able to compete as Britain in that space. But even after HS2, it might be difficult for the UK PLC to bid for another high-speed project using only domestic expertise. Okay. Industrial reality. So what might a modern supply chain look like? What strategic competitive issues and advantages might motivate it? Because we have to judge those, all of them, against the growing industrial pressure. Every country wants a factory. Now, a decade ago, to this audience, you simply would not have bought that comment. I can assure you, every time my company wins a very large contract, the country concerned, from Morocco to Algeria, doesn't matter, wants a factory. So it's a new realpolitik, if you like, of our industry. Every project wants local content. Zeitgeist. So that makes the art of mobilisation, fast mobilisation, and assembly plants an essential part of a supply chain strategy. You agree with that? Does it make sense to you? I have to say, I've been through 3 cycles in my career, and I could easily have stood here a decade ago explaining why that was nonsense. So in a decade, I believe that we've come a full 360 degrees. So the sophistication sitting behind relatively simple subsystems will include components, perhaps made around the world, often outhouse, and assembled in a country of choice. That's how it's going to be. Is this competitive compared to bringing in a finished subsystem or a system or even a train? And the answer is yes. Yes, it can be. Because the logistics... In fact, I'm going to explain something I'm going to go a bit off-piste here. I know that Alstom and its largest competitors have done analysis that have looked at the potential for a supply from a world market to a hypothetical domestic market, and not one of the competitors is further than 5% from parity today. So that's an interesting change in every conceptual thing that we've been taught and brought up with as business managers. So we've actually come full circle, and it is almost as cheap, almost as competitive, but certainly if you include the life cycle costs and the sense of why you would manufacture something in a domestic country, it's within 5% of shipping that thing in from a third world low labour cost country. Good. I've surprised you. But it's true. It's not true, it's my view of the truth. You might disagree. So we see parity more and more. And reshoring to the UK is a growing phenomenon. And David Cameron has been really quick to spot that. Reshoring and onshoring is now part of the political scenery. But it's not stupid political commentary. I think it's probably appropriate because he's got the time roughly right. So all of that makes the supply chain a really hot issue. Arguments about deliverability, sustainability, are far more complex today than 20 or 30 years ago. So I'm going to ask you a question now, ladies and gentlemen. I have the answer. It's an outrageous answer, but I'm going to ask you the question. Not all things are the same, of course, and in engineering terms we know that. But what commodity, if we were dealing in commodities, what commodity does an aircraft jet engine turbine approximate in pounds per kilogram sold? Come on, clever dicks. Name a commodity. Thank you. It's gold. The commoditized value of the noble parts in an aircraft jet engine approximate the price of gold. Now I'm going to ask the same question for a rolling stock carriage. What commodity approximates per kilogram sold a railway carriage? It's very good. I can be more accurate. It's a Big Mac and fries, actually. So you were closer to that. Clearly not the same. Clearly different outcomes to an industrial planner or to an industrial planning strategy. But it makes the point. Shipping heavy hollow tubes from somewhere in the world can be completely stupid, can't it? But we know that. We kind of know it. A calculation of how many trains you can fit in containers and put them onto the high sea, and how long that journey takes, and where you offload them, and if any faults in a train. And Alstom has a bad experience of shipping in I think it was the Gulf of Bothnia. One of our Pendolinos for Finland went to the bottom of the sea, I think, at that point. And it was £27 million of insurance claims, and 6.5 years later before they had a replacement. So there are horror stories about shipping and logistics I don't even go into. So, then, what does failure look like? These, I don't know what that picture is. If they're suspiciously Asian people, that's not really the point here, so don't look too closely. It's about cars queuing. That's supposed to be a metaphor of what happens if the railways don't work. 10 years from now, when the UK market peaks and starts to decline, and we don't have an export capability, the industry will decline. It's not an academic point I'm making, it's just a fact. There will be a sudden drop in investment in skills and innovation again, and we'll go back through the cycle. It'll lead to a spiral downwards to being an importing country again. We won't have achieved anything because we've tactically succeeded only in delivering our projects. And that's unacceptable. It'll make us uncompetitive and at the whim of foreign technologies and, of course, foreign exchange rates. You've seen the issues we've faced recently with the prices of gas, imported energy. It's the same. and then indeed increase costs when we have to ramp up again to meet demand in our own next economic cycle. And we'll be critical of that, and it'll be our children being critical as engineers, saying, why haven't we done anything about this? We've seen this clearly with the British nuclear industry, and Alstom can talk at length about the British nuclear industry because we're nuclear suppliers. It's been appalling. The whole industry disappeared, and the whole industry is now being resurrected and retrained. It's a shocking cost. So the warnings are really, really clear. So, if that is a vision, if that's a deplorable, terrible vision of success and failure, let me now move on to the concluding part of the lecture, please. It's called Fast Track for Growth. And it's the final section, and it's the response of the UK supply chain. It's the response to those Damoclesian fears and worries. What are we doing about it? That's the key point for tonight. The trends and the challenges that I've just described have been really the backdrop or the backcloth for months of deliberation by the new rail supply group, which I co-chair. Now, there have been intensive discussions with the government, so it's very good. It's the first tick in the box. It really is to its credit. It's heeded these points, it's understood the points, it's understood the problematic, and it's understood the challenges of the supply industry. And it joined me in creating a council, so we have a council. And the government has got it. The UK railway should always have been, and indeed is, in all but name, strategic. And that's how it should be seen. Now, we've grappled with all those questions I presented to you tonight in those types of forms, but without the data, but with a sense of knowing the concerns. And we've arrived at a pretty clear set of what I call them initial answers. Over the coming decade, we have a unique opportunity, I would argue, to renew our domestic supply chain so it can seize the growing business opportunities at home and abroad. That's jobs and skills and new technologies, investment, growth and innovation, resulting in higher efficiency, reduced costs and a better service ultimately for passengers, which is what it's all about. So in short, we have the chance to create a truly world-class supply industry again. Very easy to say, very difficult to pull off. So a couple of weeks ago, we launched this thing with a vision document. It was called Vision for the Rail Supply Industry, Fast Track for Growth. Both Secretaries of State stood up to be counted. They attended and spoke, and they gave highly supportive speeches. That's excellent. Really excellent. And was really quite a surprise for me, but it was still excellent. And what does it say? What do we aim to do? By 2025, and I hope now, seeing those prior slides and putting them into context, this hopefully gives you the sense of why we're aiming at these things and not other things. By 2025, which is a long time away, but we're going to need every year, we will more than double export volumes and values. We will attract the very best of UK talent to create a sustainable skills base. We'll harness the energy, the drive and the innovation of SMEs, and we will be a global leader in high-speed rail. Yes, we will. And we will have an entrepreneurial supply chain that constantly innovates. So in short, a radically transformed supply industry, making the UK a global leader in rail. So let me address those one by one. Why? Well, the first one's pretty obvious. I think I've beaten that one to death, if you agree. The second one, attracting the very best UK talent to the rail sector. Because today we really don't use the wide range of talent coming through our education system. We really don't. We've got an ageing, male-dominated workforce, and other sectors are really beating us into second place with the best talent today. I was encouraged, by the way, by Patrick McLaughlin, who announced at the Conservative Party conference that he wants to make 2018 the year of the engineer, to inspire the next generation of engineers. That's fantastic. All of us need to get behind that and support it. We need to get young people into engineering and certainly into the rail sector. And it would be good advice, by the way. Steve Halliday, I was with him the other day, and Steve Halliday is the head of National Grid. He's a good speaker. And he said to me that he had an experience of one of his managers who had been to school, and the school had told a story about a father who had a daughter that was thinking of going into engineering. And the father was distraught and actually begged the girl to think twice and to change that decision and to change that thought process and to get it and to go into banking or something. So we have some massive inadequation between what we think is of a good industry and a successful industry and the potential, and actually what's being played out in the language at school. It's still terrible. It really is that bad. So we all need to do everything we can to put a spurt on. And we wouldn't be underselling the industry. We wouldn't be underselling it. Third, harnessing the energy and innovation of a greater number of SMEs. Grassroots matter. Why? Because there are more world-class SMEs out there in other sectors who can prosper, and by diversifying into rail, we've got a win-win. Fourth, global leader in high-speed 2. Why? Because we really have the opportunity. HS2 and HS3, we can take a global lead in that industry, if that industry pulls together. And finally, we have the highly innovative and entrepreneurial supply chain. Why? Because this should be a no-brainer. As we grow and develop over the next decade, it's a minimum requirement. And it should leave us in a position of being global leaders in rail. So last year we started the process of creating this council. It's 15 members, looks like this. And it's in its first phase of change, of course. People are now, have been in this for a year and will rotate. The council is made up of 15 people, but that's inclusive, not exclusive. It includes the supply chain bigwigs, but it also includes customers, and it includes government and other stakeholders. People will sit on the board for 2 years, the council for 2 years, and then rotate. And I've made an expression of commitment myself, which is that by the time that board has rotated once, it'll be sub 40 years old and 50% diverse. We are completely white and we are completely male, and it certainly reflects badly on all of us. Now, however, clever people they are, and those people have created 5 work streams, and the 5 work streams should resonate. They're exports and inward investment, they're technologies and innovation, they are people, SMEs and high-speed rail. It's a strong team, and it's one I'm proud to lead with the 2 Secretaries of State. Now, a council and a council business, it is not just a railway idea. And to all of you sitting there looking cynically and suspiciously at this damn thing and saying, just another thing, the other 11 strategic councils of Britain have a council. And what we've spent the last 1.5 to 2 years thinking about and working on is stealing those ideas, what worked for those other councils, what didn't work, and modifying and adapting accordingly so we've got a better chance of an early start in life. So, with that, I could have referred to the Defence Council, we spent a lot of time with them, or the Aerospace Council, but I'm going to reflect for a moment on the Automotive Council. And before I go into saying anything about this, I want to say something about the funding of the railway. I do not believe for one moment that the funding that comes through the Network Rail funding process, the CP process, the control periods, is sufficient to run a successful railway. I think we need more. I think we need more money. But what I'm not willing to say is that any of that has to come from the public purse. But what we need to do is have an intelligent debate about how much we really do need and how that's going to be gotten funded. Because if all we do is wait for CP trickle down, then the supply chain is going to wait an awful long time. And it needs to get its act together, take its own risk decisions on this industry. Automotive did do that. It was a basket case 30 years ago. I'm sure you all remember. And I'm sure you all drove some of those cars in between them being brilliant and today. I certainly did. I grew up on those British cars. And this world-class, worldwide industry has benefited most from coordinating things. It's got a flexible workforce. It's got an openness to creativity and innovation and a reputation for good design. And all of that is resulting in over 6 billion of investment in recent years from global vehicle manufacturers. So it's got its inward investment. Britain is now the 4th largest vehicle producer in Europe. And I have to tell you, the French still don't know that. Speak to a Frenchman, go to a bar, have a chat. They'll tell you there's no car industry in Britain. It's true. They really don't think it's here. They don't think there's any industry here behind it. Every 20 seconds, a car, a van, a bus, or a truck rolls off a UK production line. And over 80% of those are exported to more than 100 countries. Is it a classic British model? Is it hell? What is it? Try and define it. It's not obvious. It's difficult to explain and express. The railway has to take its own consideration for what it can do locally, what it should do locally, what it might do locally, and build a plan. And the plan is going to be far more sophisticated than a pure made in Britain plan. And that's the way we're going to trap and develop or exploit worldwide investment in the UK market. So we're building a model that's been developed and exploited and has been successful in other sectors. Now, that means we've got a new challenge because we launched this vision document, which is nothing really in itself except a set of pictures and ideas expressed by the facts and the statistics I've presented to you tonight. Here's the problem. The government like it so much, they've asked us to produce an industrial strategy. Now, I contend, first of all, we wouldn't even know what one was if it hit us in the face. And secondly, try writing one. Try thinking about what that might look like. An industrial strategy for UK for railways. But thirdly, they want it by July. That's what we want to do. Now, this is a moon landing in terms of impossibility. But if we get it right, the prize is phenomenal. The government wants to support and invest in our supply chain. We want to export around the world. We've been asked to open the doors and create an industrial strategy for the first time ever in the railway. Well, first time in my lifetime anyway. And the government wants to have clear priorities set and expressed to it so it can help us invest in years to come. So that's fascinating. It's brand new. It's a great opportunity. And it's a visionary moment that's so positive. I think it's the one that I would like to leave you with. So, I've described tonight, ladies and gentlemen, a potentially exciting situation, a potentially exciting scenario. But it will fail if only a small council sits in a corner, huddles, ruminates and becomes a talking shop. It absolutely needs the broad support of industry and the broad support of engineering and indeed in your support to push it forward. So we need your engagement, we need your feedback, and indeed we want to hear your ideas for what this industrial strategy might contain or not contain. What are the priorities? Where are the gaps? Where does really have the greatest for the UK in terms of technology potential? What are we really good at? So, in conclusion, I firmly do believe the future of rail is bright. And I can say that because, honestly, we're tackling the most destructive questions head on. If we weren't tackling those destructive questions head on, I would be really, really worried. But we are. Rising demand for passenger and freight capacity, driven by dynamic global trends, resulting in rail renaissance across the world. We're already seeing regions that haven't had a culture of rail turning to rail with enthusiasm. Of course, there are challenges to overcome, not least in building a lot of capacity quickly. I'm talking to Chris Kinchin-Smith about that at coffee. And we shouldn't apologise for that. I think the debate's got to be really aggressive now for us to do anything real as opposed to pussyfooting around. but at a cost that the market can support. And that's where exports come in for me. Rail will need to focus on being more competitive, got that. Operational efficiency, reliability, safety and security, they're all challenges that will need to be tackled head on. But we have a bold vision and a strong vision and a will to implement change in partnership with the government. So I'm confident rail will become increasingly dynamic, innovative and a sustainable and competitive industry. And it will play a central part in a truly integrated transport network and contributing to a stronger economy and, I believe, a better society. Which brings us back really to where we started with IMEC's mission statement, improving the world through engineering. So I can think of no better phrase to sum up and conclude my lecture. Thank you very much indeed.